Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to the talk Risk of Bias. My name is Santhosh Thava. I'm a foundation year doctor who graduated in 2022, and today I'm going to give you a talk about what risk of bias is, why it's relevant to your systematic reviews and studies in general, and hopefully by the end of this talk you will be, so to speak, a scientific judge. So, in terms of outline, firstly, I'll just give a brief introduction of myself, so it gives the talk a bit of credibility. Then we're going to talk about what exactly risk of bias is, what is bias even, and what are the different types of bias. Thirdly, we're going to speak about the risk of bias analysis itself. So how can we do the risk of bias analysis? And we're also going to talk about specific tools, and then marginally during that I'll also touch on the limitations of risk of bias, challenges, and how you can address those. And I'm going to give you a specific plan on how you can do the risk of bias analysis and keep the effect of these limitations and challenges of the risk of bias analysis to a minimum. So, a bit about myself, but not too much. So my name is Santhosh. I studied at Imperial College London, started in 2016. Did research extensively during my undergraduate. Did some internships first here and there, then decided that I'm really interested in the brain, particularly in neurosurgery. And then in 2020, during my fifth year, I wrote a systematic review and meta-analysis from scratch without any supervision with two of my good friends. Taught myself how to code, and that's how I, in the end, computed the meta-analysis, and we published it in a top international peer-reviewed journal, and then also presented it at international conferences in Europe and in the US. And since then I've published a lot of different papers with Imperial, with Cambridge, which is mainly spinal neurosurgery, and also with Harvard, which is mainly neuro-oncology. Worked at Oxford for a couple of months, particularly on functional neurosurgery. Research is still ongoing, and right now I'm a foundation trainee for FY1 at Southend University Hospital. I'm doing research as an associate for EANS, and I've also been accepted to the Clinical Entrepreneur Program. So, and then in September I start my neurosurgery residency. So with neurosurgery, it's quite academic in nature, and inherently speaking. So research has always been a big passion of mine, and I continue to do it. So hopefully, given my experience, you guys will believe what I'm about to tell you. Obviously not the total truth. Never trust just one person on information. After the talk, go and read up more. But I'm going to give you some good links that I think will be helpful. But hopefully this will give you a quick snapshot of risk of bias analysis, so it saves you some time and some worries later down the line. It's often, unfortunately, not true, because you have confounders. Confounders, like in the comic earlier, being human subjectiveness. So, thing is, there are a lot of different types of bias. A lot of types. If you Google types of bias, there's loads of websites talking about all the different types of bias, and I suggest you to go on to this website and read through all of them and make yourself familiar with all of them. Especially for your systematic review, you want to have an idea of a broad range of biases. But for the purposes of this talk, I will focus on what I think are the 5 most important ones. Selection bias, performance bias, detection bias, attrition bias, and reporting bias. Selection bias. So selection bias really, so the people who aren't included or who choose not to respond or to be included immediately incur bias to it, because they're immediately skewing the patient sample for oftentimes very relevant reasons. This one is really all about participant blinding, right? If we blinded the participants, we could really get rid of this performance bias. Now, the way to get rid of detection bias is all about investigator bias. Investigator, or for example, if it's animal studies, caregiver bias. And the way to, again, get rid of this is to blind them. And how can investigators be biased? It's pretty obvious, but two big ones are measurement bias. So, for example, the example I gave you, the instruments used to measure the outcomes are not calibrated or validated, for sure. If they're, for example, using their own tool, which they've just made up, then they could have made the tool in a way that it benefits their own study and their own sort of hypothesis. Equally, if they're not blinded, measurement bias will be due to human error. Then, interpretation bias. The assessors are not blinded to the treatment allocation. So, for example, this is exactly the example, really, from the surgeon. But this time it's not about the participant, right? But it's about the surgeon himself. He did the operation, so post-operatively, obviously, he'll be inherently biased because he's the operator. So, unconsciously speaking, score likely higher or more positive. And similarly, attrition bias is very similar to that, but it's once a study has already started. So, for example, people are getting a drug, right? It's a cancer drug, and you have way A to B, A to death, start of the trial to death, and then halfway through, people drop out. And then later on, you find, oh wow, 70% of the people who had the drug actually went into remission. But was it really 70%? What happened to those 20% of the initial sample size that dropped out? These people weren't included in the end analysis. Now, if you went and dug deeper, you'd find out that oftentimes these 20% actually didn't go into remission. They got cancer again. And then they were like, oh, obviously not working. I'm going to drop out and enjoy the last 6 months I got with my family and not participate in this study. Very reasonable, or skews the study extremely. Now, the last one is reporting bias. So, reporting bias, it occurs when the study results are selectively reported or interpreted, leading to an incomplete or distorted picture of the findings. So, an example of that would be publication bias and outcome reporting bias. Publication bias is there in the whole medical field. Most journals tend to publish more studies that found something significant. If you don't find anything significant, you will be published somewhere. It's a finding, definitely. And me personally, I think it's very important. But because the way journals work, they want more reads, more clicks, more citation, and people are inherently more likely to go into fields where there's growth, where there's more findings. It's in the end, if you distill it, it's all down to sort of financial benefit. There's an inherent publication bias, very hard to control. Next one is outcome reporting bias. So for this again is let's say the investigators, right? They do their study on these rats, and the topic is, again, a chemotherapeutic drug of the brain, and they look at remission, they look at cell damage, blah blah blah, a lot of different things. Now they find also a lung complication, right? 50% of these rats get lung fibrosis. Now they're thinking, oh, okay, this is really about brain cancer, not about the lung, so we're going to leave that out and just focus on this. Now, this is selective outcome reporting, and it really skews things because these investigators are using selective outcome reporting and often justifying it with seemingly reasonable reasons, but it skews again the path from A to B. So, what can we do about this? I just told you a lot about sorts of bias, but it seems almost miserable because there's so many sources of bias. So even the top journals, even the top papers, everyone is trying to reduce bias. No study is free of bias, purely mainly because of the human component to it. Humans are unconsciously biased. There's always somewhere along the line where there's some sort of human, not random error, but controllable error coming in, and it's hard to control everything. But the whole, I want to say, game of science, the game of research is trying to make a study that is as controlled for bias as possible. And in order to do that, what you need to do is know about all sources of potential bias and know how to run risk of bias analysis. Now, risk of bias analysis is useful for two things. Number one, when you're reading papers, so acquiring knowledge, but also when you're generating knowledge by planning and writing your own studies, which includes systematic reviews. And Cochrane, the sort of main institution for reviews, recommends that you use it. So, when you're reading papers, the knowledge of bias will allow you to really understand how important this paper and their findings actually are, because you'll understand how good the methodology is, which will then influence how much weight you put on the outcomes. For your own study, why is it essential for the systematic review? It helps you identify the strengths and weaknesses of the individual studies, and then, because a systematic review is sort of a synthesis of a lot of different studies, you can then weigh different studies according to their bias profile. So studies with high risk of bias are given less weight in your conclusion than studies with low risk of bias. And ultimately, what you want to end a systematic review with is recommendations for the whole field. And if you find that loads of studies are having, lack of blinding, for example, or heterogeneous patient characteristics, right? So you have 20 studies and all of them are undergoing a risk of bias analysis, and you find particular deficits. Not just, loads of your papers are bad. There's also finding is a big alarm to the whole field that, okay, you need to start taking your methodology more seriously. But if a specific thing, like for example a heterogeneous patient sample, then it can really help the field to then go forward and say, oh, okay, this is something we must collectively address. So, what I did miss about that, my bad. So it's not this circular, it's a circle. So the other one exists as well, but this is the one I want to talk about. It's the one for animal studies, for stage 0 studies. Because, and this actually I only realized pretty recently, you can write a systematic review on animal research and translational research. It's massively important. And for those, you can't just use the same tools you have as for human studies. You need to use specific ones for animal studies. They're similar, but there are some differences. And again, it has sort of different domains. It says cover selection bias, performance bias, detection bias, attrition bias, and reporting bias. And there's also some niche things such as, for example, random housing. Because, for example, if you put rats next to each other, they will influence each other. Or, for example, if you have rats and you stack them above each other, like I'm doing a study right now on sort of methodology of particular study animals for brain cancer treatment, and none of the studies of the 20 included studies involve how address how the rats were housed. But it's been shown that rats, for example, if they're housed together, they influence each other. If they're stacked up, if the cages are stuck upon each other, the rat at the bottom end will behave differently to the one at the bottom. At the top. And it's also about light, humidity, temperature, a lot of things that can have a huge effect on animals, rather so than on humans. Like this one. It's a traffic lights graph, and it will give you a beautiful overview of your risk of bias. The different components particularly are: number one, confounding, selection of bias, pretty straightforward. Then they have classification of interventions, so this means that where, for example, if there's a treatment arm, if there are two treatment arms and they're looking at two different approaches, operative approaches, have they really explained and specified the operative approaches enough? Have they made it detailed enough? So there is no sort of like room for small differentiation. So if it's, for example, an anterior approach with the spine, it can be anterolateral, it can be straight anterior, and you can't just group that as anterior. So you have to be very specific. And if they aren't, then you have a high risk of bias in this domain. Then deviation from intended intervention. So if the study protocol, for example, if you register a trial, you always register it in like, for example, golf trial. So read, if you're coming across a site that's been registered, you look at the protocol first. Then look at the paper, the published paper, and see if it's aligned. Did they actually do what they wanted to do? If they have, then midway through the study they realize, oh, this is not as great as we thought. Maybe let's also add, if it's a diagnostic test, besides the biochemical test, let's add ultrasound as well and join it. You can't do that. Can't do that. That's like skewing again. The missing data, straightforward. Measurement of outcome, there's measurement bias, and then selection bias. So obviously both these tools, right, have their own respective websites. And when you actually go and do the analysis yourself, you should go to these websites, download the template, and read them all. And I've only given you 3 tools because I think they are the 3 most important. I've never used any other ones rather than those. But make yourself very familiar with these. Read the whole sort of template, because once you read it, you know it forever, and then you can use it over and over again. Now, the ROB2, basically very similar to the Robbins one, it's just for randomized controlled trials. Okay. So, analysis. Regarding the code, I've published many of these, and I've published my code as well on how to code the risk of bias analysis. It's online as well. If you just put in risk of bias analysis plot R code, you can use that. Or if you go on my LinkedIn page, Santhosh G Thava, in my bio there's a link to my GitHub repository. Go on there. Have a read of the code, and in my latest paper on radiology, in the supplementary file, the whole code is there as well for the whole meta-analysis plus all the graphs, so you can just take the chance, repurpose it for your own study, and make the graph. And then obviously, because you don't want just a graphical representation of your findings, you also want some sort of text to go with it. Write it up in your results, address the findings also in discussion somewhere marginally, and then in the limitations. So limitations, if you find that there's a lot of sort of selection bias, then say, yeah, the field suffers from selection bias, but also say somewhere that obviously only 2 people rated, so there's some sort of human bias in your own study at play as well. So that's all there is to risk of bias analysis. I hope everything was really clear. And yeah, if you have any questions, reach out to me. You can text me on LinkedIn. I reply to messages very quickly. It's Santhosh G Thava. And yeah, I hope this was useful. Again, as always, in my lecture on a quote by one of my best friends, Mahmoud, who said the cost of perfection is terminal vigilance. He said this while we were writing our first ever paper. Didn't know what the hell was going on, but no matter if you know what you're doing or not, if you're continuously trying to reach perfection, you reach it. You'll be very close to it in the end. So with that said, best of luck. I would appreciate feedback. And again, if any questions, do reach out to me. Thank you very much.